Hi, well, thanks for that wonderful introduction. My name's Steve Glass, this has already been told. I'm here today to talk about my adventures in mobile phone security. As Pat said, I've been working in the wireless area for about the last 10 years. That's been pretty much entirely focused on security. These days, I've kind of made a bit of a switch into cloud security, but for a hobby interest, this is what I've been doing. So, pressing on. Standard disclaimer applies. This has nothing to do with my employers. I won't tell you who my employers are. They're not interested. Also, if you do start to decide that this is going to motivate you and you want to start listening to telephone calls and you want to get into all of that thing, and I must be honest, that's why I got into this, then I'm not going to post bail for you, okay? Don't get caught. So, today I plan to talk about these few things. We're going to recap on mobile telephony. I'm then talking about the practical problems of running your own base station, what you can do if you run your own base station, and we're going to go through some of the steps involved in capturing traffic. So if you want to do a more passive type of attack and capture traffic off the air, what would be involved there? So modern networks split into two parts. The network infrastructure, which you don't see, and mobile telephone, which you do see. And on that phone, there'll typically be multiple sort of processor cores now, but there's two separate processors. There's the application processor, which is the thing that's running, in my case, iOS, but you may be running Android or whatever else. And then there's a baseband. Now, what makes this interesting is the application processor, in the case of the iOS, is running something with ASLR, it's got DEP, it's all the wonderful modern 21st century protections we expect for our software code base. But the baseband processor is a different kettle of fish. It's actually only available from a small number of manufacturers. And those manufacturers are basically subject to very strict licensing conditions. So in order to get their firmware validated, they submit the whole lot to the appropriate telco authority, and they get it assessed, and they say, yes, you've got a big stamp on it. But in order for that to actually go ahead and be allowed to connect to the telco's infrastructure, they have to make sure there's a very narrow interface between the rest of the system and that processor. And the way it's done is typically that it becomes the master in a master-slave relationship. Right, so if you go going through it, the thing is that there's only a handful of basebands. And what we've seen over the years is that most of these baseband processors use 1990s technology. They're not using ASLR, they're not using DEP. Apart from one example here, there is no split between the operating system code and the application code that's running the network stack. So think about that. Every computer you've used since MS-DOS has had a split between the kernel and the user mode. But that doesn't exist in these processors, with the honorable exception of iPhone 4, which has a very secure operating system kernel and runs all the device drivers and all the network support in user mode, and the kernel itself, in the very small trusted code base, runs in the executive mode. Trouble is that all the additional code that was added to the secure L4 microkernel, which is what actually sits underneath this, is rubbish. So if you attack the baseband, you've actually got, you can crack the whole thing open, and you're sitting there with complete control of both processors. So the other part of the equation, and of course that only sort of covers smartphones. If you don't have a smartphone these days, every 8-year-old will laugh at you. But the network infrastructure is the bit that you communicate with. And you're used to seeing telephone communications described as cellular. We often have this kind of diagram representing each cell as a hexagon. They can be large or small. Typically here in the city centre of Brisbane, you'll have some very small pico cells which cover maybe a shopping mall. Then if you get out into country areas, you can have cells as wide as 35 kilometres wide. Those cells, will actually be operating adjacent cells on different frequencies. That's all this is trying to show, so that you don't get interference from one cell to the next. And what happens is your telephone switches on. The first thing it does is to try and find out which base stations it can communicate with. And while you're sort of walking around, traveling around, the network is trying to keep tabs on you all the time. So even though your phone looks as though it's passive and not doing anything, it's continuously engaging in a discussion with the base stations where they're saying, hello, TIMC number blah, 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 are you in my cell? And they're going, yeah, I'm here. And then the base stations are measuring the received signal strength, and they may decide to cause a handover to another cell. But all the time, there's this like continuous mechanism going on where there are messages being exchanged. And the problem with that is not all those messages are authenticated. And that opens the door to a number of problems. But I'll talk you through, gone too far, talk you through this slide, because this slide comes from the Gamma Group. The Gamma Group, the people who wrote FinFisher, have got a very bad name in our industry because they've been selling their tracking technologies to all kinds of dodgy governments to crack down on democracy advocates and people like that. They have a whole product suite designed to allow you to track mobile telephone users. And that's where the slide is taken from. And they're using those messages that go on, here's the paging exchange, in order to track whether a node is in a particular area. They have, like, in the catalog, wonderful little handheld devices and things you can strap under your coat with a little antenna that you can point in the direction of a target. And it works by exploiting capabilities that are built into the system already. So in a paging environment, this particular discussion, we have the base station, which is like that blue thing that's come out quite well, sends a paging request. And then if you look at the swim lanes, these are like physical channels of frequencies into which the GSM spectrum is divided. And the uplink and downlink are separated by 45 megahertz so that they can both transmit at the same time. That's what I'm trying to get at in this diagram. So you see the channel request comes back, and then it's an assignment by the base station to another channel. Because this BCCH channel, you'll get to see in a trace later, is continuously occurring. The base station's sitting there streaming out these messages all the time. And it's basically polling almost all the handsets in that base station's coverage range to say, are you here? And so what we have here is then the rest is the call setup, basically where we have a response from the mobile back to the base station. The base station says, right, we're going to start ciphering. Unfortunately, my choice of colors doesn't show, but from the point of the cipher message onwards, everything becomes encrypted. And then what happens next is that we start switching to a voice channel. These two channels at the bottom are voice channels. Now, that's the physical voice channel. I've also labeled the one FACCH because what it is it's a logical channel. So it's really complicated because you've got this time division, a frequency division between uplink and downlink so that you can transmit at the same time. You've got frequency division between different channels so the base station can share them out as it wants. Then you've got division into time slots. So as the swim lane proceeds, time proceeds. And sometimes we'll use, on a particular physical channel, we will reserve certain time slots and we'll call them a logical channel. That allows a mobile phone to listen to the one physical frequency, but to hear more than one physical channel at once. So what happens during call setup, for example, we have the voice channel starting off as a control channel and then becoming a voice channel. After that, it will jump around in frequency terms. It's a little bit detailed, I apologize. I prepared this for some students at UQ. So the details are probably a little bit too much for now, but as long as you've got the gist that this stuff can be a bit complicated. And until you start an authenticated exchange, most of the messages prior to authentication, obviously, are not authenticated messages. They can be used. And in terms of tracking people, we'll talk about later, there's certain call types that can be abused in order to allow that physical tracking of people. The actual authentication happens every time you switch a modem on, phone on, every time that you move between cells, just sometimes randomly by the cell itself, it'll basically initiate a re-authentication. And the trick here is that there's a SIM card which contains a secret key, and that's shared with Telstra or whoever your home operator is. It's never shared with the base station. That's quite important. The protocol here, again, very detailed, you can't really see what's going on. But this party over on my right-hand side, or our right-hand side, is actually the authentication center. That's basically Telstra. Over at the far left-hand side, you have the user equipment, and it's trying to authenticate to a particular base station. And in order to do that, the base station contacts the authentication center and says, right, I need an authentication key for this communication to go ahead. That key or tuple is sent to it. It sends one of the values down to the mobile. It's got the encryption key. It needs this magical random value. It can recreate the other values it needs. If it then responds correctly to the mobile, you've authenticated. At the same time, you've achieved a key exchange that you can use for subsequent communications. Obviously, that means you're encrypted from this point on, and encryption, well, in this world, it doesn't have a good record. It started off, mobile telephones came along in the analog form. Back in the 90s, people like myself would listen to them on our scanners and laugh at people because they used to say embarrassing things, and that was really funny. And if you were British royalty, then people would record the embarrassing things they said. The other side was the mobile system, when they planned in cryptography, was done with a Cold War mindset. Countries like Germany wanted strong cryptography because they didn't want the East Germans listening to their mobile telephone messages. They lost out. The British wanted weak cryptography so they could spy on everybody. That's what actually won. So what we have is a series of rather weak ciphers. For voice, we have A50 through to A53. A52 is one designed for export markets, deliberately weak. Probably the real criminal part of this is the null ciphers that you see right there on the far left-hand edge. Null ciphers, wherever you see them, if it's in SSL or anywhere else, are a huge design flaw. There's some very, very clever people whose job it is, and who have the technical capability, to put themselves in the middle of that communication and force it back to that null communication state. So it's always, always, always a bad design feature. But it was put in because countries like India ostensibly did not want encryption, which actually makes this problem real. I put in my spiel, what kinds of things are we seeing? Why is this newsworthy? Why is this, not back in 2010 am I doing this, and what's actually relevant today? Well, what started happening is we're seeing fake mobile base stations appearing in some really strange places. One of them is the city centre of Oslo in Norway. Now, the city centre of Oslo is actually really important because it houses the parliament. It houses most of the official government buildings. And Aftenpost, which is like one of the newspapers of record in Norway, did a survey. And they went around with some rather clever wireless gear, and they were able to find that there were a number of fake wireless stations. Now, they didn't know what they were doing, but these are basically allowing people to authenticate, saying, I'm here, I'm your telco provider, please send your traffic to me when you want to make an outgoing call. That's a bit spooky. Perhaps spookier, especially if you've been across there, is the beltway of Washington, D.C., where all the defense manufacturers have their bases. And you can go to Lockheed Martin or whomever, Grumman, Northrop, all these big American defense contractors. And what we start to see, this was reported last year end of last year in Popular Science magazine, they're finding that these fake base stations attached to telephone poles in the car parks of these companies. Because somebody is wanting to know what people are talking about, and they're going to be prepared to go to great lengths to get that. So what is a fake base station? How do you detect it? Well, basically, it's just like this. Go back to an earlier diagram. We have a bad guy. He's just sparked up. He's got an antenna. He's got the relevant equipment. He's able to talk the protocol. He's saying, please speak to me. And unfortunately, this shouldn't work. Because when we talked about the authentication protocol earlier, I said there was a secret key shared between your telco provider, the Telstra or wherever, and your phone. And your phone's not disclosing that information, and Telstra shouldn't be disclosing that information. So how on earth can someone pretend to get in the middle and say, once you've got an authentication exchange take place, they should be locked out of the picture. But it doesn't happen that way because of that null cipher. That null cipher, we can roll back to it, and if you've got a null cipher, you can say, yeah, I'll accept anybody to connect. Luckily, some phones will give you a warning of that. This is from a secure Android phone that came out last year. And it'll tell you that there's a rogue base station because this guy's turned off cryptography. I need you to know about this. In fact, every telephone is capable of doing this because in the SIM card, there's something called a ciphering indicator. It's a flag. It's a 1-bit Boolean flag that if it's turned on, should cause your telephone to warn you that you've wandered into an unencrypted communication zone. Anybody ever seen one of those errors? One. Where did you see that? Okay, right. I've never met anybody who's been in that position. I'd love to talk to you afterwards. It's really interesting. Most of our phones have that bit set to 0 by default. We don't care whether the phone's enciphered or not. We're quite happy to speak because it's much easier for your telephone's provider, for Vodafone, GSM, whoever they are, to sort of not take the support call off you. Because if you go, well, my phone's saying something about encryption, what's going on, dude? They don't want to hear that. So what are the threats you get from evil base stations? Well, one kind of call that we can engage in is basically a blind call. And that's where the base station sends a control message to the telephone and says, right, I want you to start transmitting a stream of information back. It's not actually meaning anything, but it's turning on the transmitter. If the transmitter's turned on, we can go back to that direction finding stuff I was talking about the gamma group doing. Because the other thing in a GSM network, or any mobile phone network, is the base station's in control. It actually controls how much power your telephone is going to use to talk to it. You can force it to be very, very powerful. It's going to flatten the battery quickly, and that's not normally something they want. Normally, you're in a city where you've got pico cells with very small limited range, we'll dial the power right down. But you can turn the power right up so that you can track somebody through the city centre. And that blind call facility was built in from the very get-go. Eavesdropping, even in a normal base station, this kind of fake base station I was talking about, where you've turned on the null cipher, you're only pretending to be the network. You can only receive mobile-originated calls. That's calls that's outgoing from the mobile. But any calls that were originally routed to the mobile are going through the normal network infrastructure, and just won't be delivered because the mobile's camped to your access point or your base station. That's a problem for an hostile adversary, but we can get around it. There are attacks against cryptography that we can do if you've got a mobile base station, an evil base station. And particularly if we run an IMSI catcher, which is a very special kind of mobile base station, fake base station, which is basically doing a classic man-in-the-middle attack. There are some SIM attacks, and I'm going to talk about baseband attacks at the end because that's really where I've been playing with and what I'm looking at. Here's location tracking. You wander through the city, you're constantly broadcasting the signal because you've been told to, you're going to be followed. IMSI catchers, there's huge numbers of these things out there. WikiLeaks have been carrying a whole series of product brochures for them forever. And this was taken from a particular company that's selling a secure mobile phone, and you can see there's quite a variety there. We've also, thanks to Edward Snowden, seen the Ant catalogue, and it kind of fit in that the NSA have the best toys. Here's 2 generations of their IMSI catching technologies, and you can bet they're a lot better than the stuff that's available commercially, if only because some of the things that we now know means that this stuff should be a lot better. But even if you haven't got the NSA-grade technology, you can actually bypass and wipe out the cryptography if you can run a man-in-the-middle attack. And that's what this Barkin BM Mcallen attack is about. That when somebody's authenticating to your network, that 3-party authentication exchange I mentioned, the man in the middle is pretending to be the base station towards the phone. Towards the network, he's pretending to be the handset. So he's now just sitting there saying, right, I'll relay messages as it suits me. When he's given the challenge from the base station, which he has to respond to an authentication exchange, he passes it on to the mobile. Well, normally that wouldn't get you anywhere. But the trick is, he dials back the cipher level to use the insecure A52 cipher. So when that challenge is answered, he now has enough information to get the encryption key. And because the encryption key is delivered precisely once, we then restart a new challenge saying, no, we're going to up the encryption level this time. Now we're running with A51, and I want you to authenticate to me again. Oh, here's your challenge, and then replays the same challenge. Now that should be trivially detectable because you've seen the same challenge twice and you've seen the cipher downgrade. But if your phone's not going to tell you when it doesn't see an insecure connection, you can bet your bottom dollar it's not going to do it there. And this stuff has been around forever. It's, as I said, it's in principle very easily detected. Secure phones should be able to do this, but it is an instant security level rollback attack. SIM attacks, well, we've seen, again, the news this week, another Snowden leak. The Gemalto hack. When the key, the secret key that's on that SIM card is leaked, all communications to that telephone, now and forever, are going to be compromised. If you know that one piece of information about a particular telephone call, nothing is secure anymore, because it is the master key in a key hierarchy that generates all the session keys. And the way it sounds, I'm not sure about the details of the hack, that Gemalto were using some kind of hashing routine rather than just randomly assigning these encryption keys to each SIM. They were just generating them via some kind of hash. So that means that if you've got this kind of government-grade equipment, they can probably break almost anybody depending upon the SIM, let alone knowing any crypto flows there. They don't need to go down there. They can already just go back to the key. Last year at Black Hat, Carsten Knoll did a really good talk, which was, I suppose, the poor man's version. If we can't hack into Gemalto and get the master KIs, how might we be able to do it ourselves? And he came up with a really clever hack that says, well, there's an awful lot of cards out there that you use in DES. And this is 56-bit rubbish DES that we all know about. It takes about 20 years on a commercial CPU. Shouldn't be hard to break. And what he did was he sent a message to the telephone which was basically a silent SMS, a message that never appears to the user. It's addressed to the SIM itself. And that message was flawed. It was basically crafted in such a way that would generate an error. And the error gets cryptographically signed. So we have a known plain text with a known signature. And basically, I can compute for that plain text every possible key value, create a reverse index, and we can get straight back to it. Then I can sign a Java applet that I can download to the SIM card, again, via my fake base station, and use that to exfiltrate the secret key because there are meant to be some flaws to do that. I've not been able to touch this. I mean, this is Carsten, nowhere near been able to follow on. But it's a really fascinating attempt to do the same kind of thing. And it was a huge splash, but didn't seem to go very far after. The reason it's huge, if you get KI, all your communications confidentiality is gone out the window. Right. There's also something I have been playing with, without success so far, which is a feature that's been rumored to be in the GSM spec forever. The original GSM spec did have this. It's got removed subsequently. The functionality is still there if you send the right messages in the right order. That's what I'm told by some people I regard as GSM experts. And what a silent call does is very similar to the blind call, which is I'm going to talk to your telephone and cause it to do something quietly, without your knowledge, just like paging does, just like any other response. In this case, turn on the microphone, digitize the audio, and send me that stream of audio back to the base station where I can intercept it. And the story I've got from the side, this FBI tap cell phone mic as eavesdropping tool appears to be what they used to basically listen in on mafiosi in America during a trial going back many, many years. But of course, even if you don't need this functionality these days, we've got a much richer set of features. If we can compromise the baseband of a phone and upload new functionality to it, then even if you didn't have this functionality built in the spec, you could download it yourself. It becomes very simple. So, my adventures. Well, I've been running my own base station for the matter of about 4 years or so, and I've been using this one, the OpenBTS one. And the really cool news if you do it today is it's a very mature product. It was designed to use cheap, low-cost, software-defined radios and for communication in countries like Africa, where setting up a cell phone tower at a cost of hundreds of thousands isn't going to happen, but there's still a huge number of people carrying on GSM handsets. They wanted a very cheap system, so they came up with one that speaks the GSM air interface and now the UMTS air interface. We're catching up in terms of generations. And at the back end, everything's done via SIP. So it's kind of like almost the right thing, but not perfect. But certainly, if you're going to want to play around with the air interface of GSM, this is the tool to do it. If you go onto the website now, you can get the O'Reilly book for free, which is really cool. So it tells you everything about how to set everything up. All the code is public domain. It's C++. It's very clean, very easy to modify. There's also a new project coming right out the traps at the moment, OpenLTE. That's a 4G base station. Right now, you can actually run an eNode B, which is basically the tower for the 4G network, using the same hardware and software that I'm currently using to run a 2G network. So it's a huge step forward. It gives you lots of stuff to play with. The problem, if you want to do that, is you're going to run into trouble with Telstra, you're going to run into trouble with ACMA, and these guys do not play, if you interfere with the spectrum that people have paid millions of dollars for, you're going to get fined. You can get very heavily fined, your equipment will be confiscated, and you may go to jail. And I'm presuming that's not an outcome most of us want to have happen. So what I've come up with is a mechanism of trying to keep myself out of jail, which was the cheapskate testbed. Over on the side here, I've got the telephone that I was using, the Motorola C123. Great thing about them is they have an external antenna jack. My iPhone doesn't have an external antenna jack, but these things do. And the idea was to connect it to the Usurp, which is the software radio over on the right-hand side, and really just use coax connections everywhere. So there's never any chance of signal leaking into the radio spectrum. And the magic device that makes it all work is in the middle. It's called a circulator. And as you can see, it's got the symbol of like a little arrow. And what it means is in that anti-clockwise direction, there's a very, very low impedance. So the transmit from the Usurp can flow down to the telephone with very low impedance and isolated then from the next hop. So it's just going down there. The phone can broadcast in the reverse direction, but going back to the transmit port, it's got very high impedance. It's not going to happen. It's going to flow between ports 2 and 3 more easily. Well, nothing happens between 3 and 1, but the device could do that quite easily. And the idea is by connecting everything up using coax cables, putting some inline attenuators, just about 40 dBs to give you about the same as you get over the air, you can actually communicate without any real risk of danger. You might, however, want to put yourself inside some kind of RF enclosure. Now, this is the one I'm using. It's like $2.5 grand's worth. It's a lot of money. But you can actually do it much cheaper. I know people at Edith Cowan in Western Australia, they took a filing cabinet, a big steel filing cabinet, earthed it, and put all the radio equipment inside that. And it was like, yeah, we've got a shielded RF enclosure, and it cost us $50. So you can use a biscuit tin. You can, obviously, you've got to be careful if you put any electrical equipment inside the box that you're not going to end up with live current on the chassis or anything like that. But it's not beyond the wit of man to be able to just punch a hole in to pass an Ethernet cable through and maybe a power cable into a biscuit tin with this equipment inside. Mine, look at it. On top, if you look back at the last photo, my Usurp. The antenna you can see is just the GSM antenna, GPS antenna, sorry, that I use for the clock. The cables coming out the front go into the back of the case and come out with this little antenna inside. So my kind of RF world is a little space like this. But it's enough for me to be able to talk to any mobile phones I've got, put them in there, can send SMSs to them, get them to register. You can buy cards from Osmocom, also the Osmo shop, which will sell you cards which have programmable KIs, which is not something you'd normally have. So you can't use your normal SIM from your normal telephone plan in there because you don't know what the key is. But you can actually do that if you buy these particular ones. And what am I doing with it? Well, I'm not doing any of the attacks we talked about earlier. They're too hard, frankly. The attacks that I can do are based upon functionality that's been inside OpenBTS forever. It got taken out, unfortunately, in version 2.8. They have a fuzzing capability built in. It's lovely. We have this ability to create a call to a particular mobile, so we address it to a particular mobile. And what that does is this little it causes the BTS to listen on a UDP port, and any traffic it receives strips off the UDP headers and then takes the traffic and says, that is a GSM frame. I will now relay that over the air to the phone. And it can be anything you want. You can use any kind of fuzzing tool that you want to send messages to the phone. Now, I think that's a really, really good buy, a really good way of getting things done. And looking at the number of places with baseband attacks where this can actually work, well, we've seen examples of Qualcomm. Ralph Philippe Wyman came up with unchecked mem copies, lifecycle issues, and initialized variables, integer overflows, things that shouldn't be there, including some real protocol stuff-ups where things were actually dealing with the CDMA stack that shouldn't actually be present in the GSM stack at all. And the functionality was still there because the stack was written to come out for both markets. And he was able to sort of send message types that shouldn't exist. BlackBerry have had these problems. So when we use this test call, we're able to sort of inject directly at layer 3 on the device. And you can't see what these blocks are here. But they're basically SMS, connection management, and the system services. Layer 1 and layer 2 messages are all fixed format. They're not really interesting. They're very small. But at layer 3, we start seeing variable length messages. It's much more fuzzable anyway. So that's really where the work is at the moment. I have a heap of slides on passive eavesdropping, but I'll probably hand over to questions now because I think if I go to them, we might run on too long.